Guys, welcome to Coliseum Forum. Today I am joined by award-winning writer John Layman, creator of Chew, Outer Darkness, Leviathan. Um, we're really excited to have you here today, John.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, as we mentioned, I mean, you've got a ton of really cool credits to your name. Chew, probably your most popular book by far. Even though
Yeah,
huge fan of Outer Darkness. Um, I kind of want to jump into the book a little bit.
sure.
I figured like what Chew ended in 2016, right?
Yeah, November 2016.
So people have had 4 years, so I want to warn everybody in advance. There may be a few spoilers here.
I
Um,
think that's fair.
but leading into your new book, Chew, which is the follow up to Chew, um, where do we leave off with Tony at the end of Chew?
Well, Tony Chu is essentially a first contact story,
Right.
and it jumps into the. I mean, I'm spoiling the ending. It jumps into the future, and basically the whole thing is a setup for a first contact with aliens. And by the end of Chu, Tony Chu is this old man who's survived it all and kind of uh, well, I mean, he literally saves the world for this meeting between humans and aliens. Uh, Chu, the new book, CHU, is about his sister Saffron, and it takes a step back and it begins where began and just goes like a
Okay.
parallel direction.
Excellent. So that
Uh,
actually answered my next question. So we're in the same timeline as Chew, running concurrently with the original series.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So the first Chew mini actually is a flashback that it starts out in the early days of the bird flu,
Right.
and it's how Tony and Colby first got teamed up.
Right.
But it's where the original Chew was uh, Tony Chew, male food powered cop. This is Saffron Chew, female food powered criminal. So it's
Okay.
it's going to be the flip side of Chew. It's food noir, and there's going to be some cross pollination between Chew. There's
Sure.
going to be some characters and events that match, but sort of the big bird flu alien conspiracy stuff that story's been told, and Saffron doesn't necessarily care about that.
Right.
So it's gonna run at the same time, but it will, as it progresses, become more and more its own thing rather than like like I compare it to Better Call Saul. But as Better Call Saul goes on, it gets closer and closer to Breaking Bad.
Right.
This, as it goes on, will get further and further away from Chew and more its own thing
Right.
because she's just a crook.
Right.
She doesn't care about conspiracies or things like that.
So as we talked about, I mean, Chew is a very popular book. It's one of our favorite indie titles at Coliseum of Comics. But you've done other things. I mean, you have Leviathan, you have Outer Darkness. Those are both awesome books by my estimation. What brought you back to the world of Chew?
Well, I mean, I spent more than a year developing it, and it is after like 65 issues, it's kind of my most developed world. And I knew I was always going to return to it. I just didn't want to do like untold tales of Tony Chu.
Right.
So I wanted to find a way to return to the world, but it would be like something new and different. And just from a more practical standpoint, like the world's already built and I've got a built-in audience, in theory, I would hope people would want more.
Right.
I needed a break, but after 3 years, it's like, God, this world was such a part of me for so long. Let's come back.
So Chew, I believe it ended at issue 60, right?
Yeah. We
So
did some specials. There were some foil
right.
specials and a revival crossover. So technically it ran 64 issues.
So for us, we'll say at the 64 with the one shots and everything, as just the comics reading public, it was over for us, which is always sad. But for you, you always kind of had the plan. You're going back to that toy box, to that sandbox at some point.
Yeah, I mean, still in my back pocket is Chew 2.
Oh,
By the end of Chew, sort of the baton has been passed from Tony to his daughter Olive,
right.
and Chew 2 would pick up in the future, where we leave off on Chew 60 and sort of like follow the events, and it would
Right.
be a very weird science fiction book.
Yeah.
but I'm saving that for whenever Rob Guillory is available. Like that was the other thing. He's got his book Farmhand.
Right.
Farmhand has its own TV series. Like Rob came back and helped with Outer Darkness Chew and did a few pages, but
Right.
but to have him on a regular title, I couldn't have him.
Sure.
And so I wanted to find something that sort of justified a new artist.
Right.
So it wouldn't seem like I was ditching Rob. But like if he ever comes back and says, hey, let's do a regular, series of minis, Chew 2 is waiting for him.
Okay. I think anybody that's a Chew fan is probably super excited to hear that. Now,
Yeah.
just
in
a
the
little bit.
meantime, we've got this other thing, the Chew, and that's it's not going to get in the way of the original series or a sequel series.
Right. So earlier you used a phrase I don't know if I've ever heard before, but I kind of want to touch on it. You called it food noir. Is that how you would describe Chew?
Well, that's how I would describe the new one. I mean, the first one, is sort of a food-based police procedural, but this is really, I don't want to say I'm ripping off Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips' Criminal,
Right.
but it's, it is Criminal set in the food world. I mean, it's a food-powered crook who surrounded herself with food-powered crooks committing food-powered crimes.
Right.
So yeah, food noir.
So, would you argue that you're maybe the leader in that genre? Police procedurals and food noir. I don't know if there's a lot of that.
I think there's been a few others since Chew. Anthony Bourdain did Get Jiro, and and Brian Wood did Starve. And I think food is it's weird because food is so universal to the human experience.
Sure.
I'm surprised there's not more food comics, but I think Chew's probably the best known one. Like we hit on something that when I was pitching it, I didn't realize how universal food is.
Sure.
And the weird thing is, like, Chew's in like a bunch of languages, and part of it's because everyone can relate.
Right.
It doesn't matter what country or culture you're from. You've eaten a good meal, you've eaten a bad meal, you can imagine something terrible. Like it's really universal to the human experience.
So now, would you consider that you're yourself maybe a foodie, or is it just kind of this kind of fell into your lap with the idea of Chew?
Well, my wife is, and all her friends are, and very early on into Chew, like I would be sitting with her arguing about like truffle butter versus this kind of smoked salt or whatever.
Right.
The way you and I would argue, could Daredevil beat the Hulk?
Right.
They would nerd out on all this crazy food stuff, and I realized they've got their own culture, and I was just kind of a fly on the wall. And
right.
I will eat a gourmet meal, but I'll also eat Taco Bell.
Right.
So I guess I can't be too big of a foodie.
So,
but it was fun to sort of immerse myself in that world.
So now you just mentioned that something you and I would probably argue about would be like, can Daredevil beat the Hulk? Let me ask you this: what led you to comics? Like, how did you find comics?
Oh, okay. This is we're going back into ancient history, but so I'm super old.
Okay.
And I discovered comics in when I was a kid, Star Wars was in the theater. We're talking 1977.
Sure.
And they didn't have VCRs. They didn't have streaming on demand. They had Star Wars at your theater, and then it was gone.
Right.
And I found out very early on that I could go to my 7-Eleven and they'd have Star Wars comics.
Right.
And so I could get my fix on Star Wars. So I would be in 7-Eleven once a month grabbing, the new issue of Star Wars so I could see what Luke and Han were doing.
Right.
And then, I'd come in some week and they didn't have a Star Wars, but they'd have like Shogun Warriors or Micronauts. And it was sort of the licensed book that got me into comics. And then I discovered like Firestorm or Teen Titans or X-Men, and
right.
it was like toy stuff and licensed stuff that led me to superheroes. And then I've never been that deep into superheroes. That sort of led me to indie stuff.
Sure.
And so I just always wanted to write comics. So this is again, I'm old, and this is like pre-internet. So I went to college and became an English major because that's like right.
Yeah.
And then when I graduated, I moved to San Diego because I heard there was a comic convention.
Okay.
And San Diego Con was much smaller then. Like my first time, I saw it all during my lunch hour. Parked on the street, and the street was dangerous, crack addicts and
Oh wow.
hookers, and you didn't want to leave your car. And I paid $5, and I saw the whole show in my lunch hour, and then went back to work. And that was San Diego, 1991.
That's what I was gonna ask. Yeah. Wow. So you just did the whole con in an hour and then went to work. That was it.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
And no one knew that I took an extended lunch hour to go to Comic-Con. And it's weird because you watched it grow. You know, I've been to San Diego Comic-Con every year since 1991,
Oh
which is
wow.
weird because now this is at the point where I would be gearing up for it, and we're not having it for the first time.
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, this is a kind of weird, and that's another thing. I mean, how are you holding up with the pandemic?
Not well, not
Yeah.
well at all. I'm barely writing. I came into 2020 with like 5 books,
Right.
and now they're all over. I've got like 2 scripts left, and like there's been such a backlog. I hate pitching anyways, and I don't have anyone to pitch to, so
Right.
I've just been kind of like working real slow on what I've got, and I finished Man Who Messed Up Time for Aftershock. I finished Mars Attacks Red Sonja for Dynamite. Finished Chew for Image.
Right.
Outer Darkness is finished, and I've got 2 issues left of Bermuda for
Okay.
IDW, and I have no idea what's next.
So what is your process like? I know you said it's kind of been a struggle with us kind of being stuck inside and everything, but when you go into your office, you sit down, and do you have like a process or any rituals or?
What I like to do is when I'm in my groove is I almost dream about it the night before. I think about the scene,
Sure.
and then I kind of like go over it in my mind and kind of half sleep.
Yeah.
And then I'm a real early riser. I wake up at 4:30, 5:30.
Oh wow.
When I'm in my groove, I jump out of bed having worked out my problems
Right.
and then type it. But now I've got like a kid at home and
Sure.
like all kinds of distractions, and I like you can only work on developing stuff for so long when you don't know who you're gonna pitch to or
Right.
like what. So I've been working at about half speed.
Oh wow. Okay. Um. So you knew. It sounds like you knew pretty early on. Like when I grow up, I want to write comics, right? So
From the beginning. Yeah,
so
yeah.
you went to
So picking up on that story,
right.
I moved to San Diego, and I worked at the newspaper, and I would freelance articles. Like Judge Dredd had a movie with Sylvester
Yeah.
Stallone, or Spawn had an HBO series. And being a nerd, I knew that stuff, so I
Right.
would pitch a story, and I was like Jimmy Olsen, like I was glorified mail boy, and I'd do like stock charts, but I would like pitch nerd stories, and I'd pitch the Comic-Con story because here's a hot new book called Bone, or here's
Sure.
a hot new book called Sandman, and I'd write articles or interview whoever, Jeff Smith, Neil Gaiman. Jim Lee had his own studio there, Wildstorm,
Yeah. Yeah.
and when you're at a local paper, they always want the local angle. So they'd be like, call up Jim Lee's studio, see what's going on there.
Right.
And I slowly got to know, over the course of 2 or 3 years, I got to know the people there. They called me up for an assistant editor position, which became an editor position,
Right.
which suddenly DC bought us, and it
Yeah.
became I was suddenly a DC editor, technically.
Right.
And by then I had done comics, for more than 5 years as in editorial, and I think I had put out like 200 comics, and I knew how it was done. So I always wanted to write, so I made the jump to freelance, and it was really hard to get gigs at first. I'd get one gig here and there,
Right.
but I knew how to letter from the paper because I knew the programs, and so I was doing a lot of lettering, which I still do. I still letter my own stuff.
Oh wow.
So I was lettering, and I'd get like a Red Sonja gig or a Thundercats gig, and then eventually a Gambit gig. And you hope each gig gets a little higher profile.
Right.
But I started freelancing in 2001. So I've been writing comics since then.
Do you remember what your first like IP pitch was? Was it Chew, or did you have something before Chew?
Oh yeah, no. I've got hold on a sec.
Sure.
So I did the first thing I owned was Bay City Jive. The first thing that I created, which was
Sure.
an image book, and this is my own collection because it was never collected. It's sort of Shaft meets Big Trouble in Little China.
Okay.
And then my first image book was a book called Puffed with Dave Crossland, which is pretty funny because when I approached Rob years later, Rob Guillory for Chew,
Yeah.
he was like the only person in the world who had read Puffed because he grew up on Dave Crossland's art,
Right.
and so he like knew me from Puffed, which is really weird. But yeah, I'd written Gambit, Red Sonja, Stephen Colbert's Tech Jansen. I did an Oni OGN called Armageddon and Son. Sorry, I'm looking at my bookshelf.
No, that's fine.
Right now.
Do you have them in chronological order up there?
No, just alphabetical.
Okay.
So yeah, I did a couple Xena Warrior Princess things for Dynamite. So I was working for Dynamite, Marvel, Image, IDW. So yeah, I mean,
you've made the rounds. You've been everywhere.
Yeah, and so Chew didn't come out until like 2009.
Right.
So I've been writing comics for not quite 10 years at that point.
So let me ask you this: what was the inspiration for Chew? Like, I mean, were you at a KFC and you were like, "What if this was frozen?"
I wish I had a clever story, but like Chew was around in some sort of incarnation for a long time, and I was pitching it and pitching it and pitching it, and no one wanted it. And eventually, I just said I was going to finance it myself. I didn't think it would go more than 5 issues, but I'd have it to show to editors.
Right.
So it's going to be like a loss leader. Like I won't make any money on this, but I'll put it out just to show editors what I've been doing.
Right.
And then it just kind of blew up. But like, what's the clever story of how it came to be? I don't know.
It was just one of those things that popped into your head one day.
Well, there was in the early 2000 aughts, there was like worries about a swine flu pandemic.
Yeah.
And the towers came down on 9/11, and as a lefty, it felt like George Bush and his people were really overreacting. Like suddenly we can't wear shoes on planes, and they've got this Department of Homeland Security, and it's like, if this swine flu happens, or let's call it a bird flu, how would someone like the George Bush administration react?
Right.
Like, how would they overreact? Oh, they'll outlaw chicken. That was the joke.
Right.
And it was almost like a Saturday Night Live gag where like, drug dealers selling eggs on street corners or chicken wings.
Right.
But then I had an idea for like the Cannibal Detective, and I had an idea for the writer who could write about stuff you could taste. And at some point, maybe this was even subconscious, I sort of realized they're all connected by food.
Right.
And if I do, like, it stops becoming a Saturday Night Live skit where it's the same joke over and over. If I suddenly make a food comic, it becomes like a very rich tapestry.
Sure.
And so Chew was a lot of different ideas that all came to that's why I don't have one story, because it's all like all these separate ideas that eventually gelled into one big thing.
That's awesome. So, like I said, we talked about a little bit before, when Chew finished for the greater comics community, we thought it was done. But for you always kind of had a plan to go back to that sandbox and kind of play around in there, right?
Well, I mean, I don't mean to sound cynical or greedy, but it's like, it's the best selling thing I've ever done.
Sure.
And it still sells. And it's one of those things where you don't want the property to be dead forever.
Sure.
And so there was always a point where, I don't want to say I wanted to return when I needed money, but there is the reality that you want to keep the property alive.
Right.
But just creatively, after a break, like 65 months in a row, I wanted off the treadmill.
Right.
But like, I'm so used to my mind spinning Chew tales that like they started coming back, and it's like, shit, I'm going to have to put, pen to paper pretty soon.
So when that happens, do you like take notes, or you just kind of like file it away in your brain?
Little of both. Depends on how good the idea is. I mean, I do have the bigger file is up here, but every once in a while, like if something that especially at the middle of the night. You know, if I wake up and have something, I
Yeah.
got to type it or I'm going to lose it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Um, so let's talk about some of your other work a little bit. Outer Darkness. How did Outer Darkness happen?
Uh, at the time, so Outer Darkness was a book that I'd been developing as sort of my next big thing. And Kirkman called me up because the Skybound wanted to option Chew. And and I thought, you know, I'd been doing Chew on my own without an editor, and I thought it would be so much easier to do it through a company this time.
Right.
Like I could just write it and have it magically turn into a comic book.
Right.
And at the time, they wanted, you know, they wanted the option to Chew, which has since expired. But it's like, well, shit, I got Kirkman on the phone. I've got this like sci-fi horror. He's the zombie TV guy.
Right.
Maybe I should mention that to him. So I did, and he pretty much approved it on the spot.
Did he just call you out of the blue, or like was this?
Yeah. I mean, AMC wanted Chew, and you know, Walking Dead is through AMC.
Right.
So he's like, you know, Skybound does a lot of Hollywood stuff. You know, we want to option Chew. And I was like, yeah, sounds great. Try to make it happen. Obviously, it did not.
Sure.
But they came close. So who knows? You know, it took Preacher 15 years.
Yeah, fair.
It'll happen eventually.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is that something we may eventually see?
Oh yeah, there's like I said, the option has expired, and people are circling around again, and that's what happens. You option a book for a while,
right?
Somebody tries to get it made, and either they do or it comes back to you, and someone options again, and that's precisely where we're at right now.
Okay, let me ask you this: have you done any like in your like fan casting? Like, have you thought about like, oh, this guy could be Tony. This could be.
Chew has been around for so long now that originally we wanted the guys from Lost, the guy who played Sawyer and Kinley Young.
Oh yeah, okay.
As Colby.
Yeah.
And then it sort of changed to Stephen Yoon from Walking Dead.
Yeah.
You know, as because you know, it's funny because Kinley Young was in the second the middle Star Wars movie,
right?
And he's like kind of gray now, and like has his like grandfatherly gravitas, and it's like like at some point he went from where he was on Lost to maybe, you know, gray, and so he's aged out of Tony,
right?
But there's a comedian named Steve Byrne that I really like, and he and I are friendly. He dressed up as Tony one time for Halloween.
Oh, that's cool.
And you know, that it evolves because, like I said, I've had Chew in my head since about 2006.
Right.
So maybe my cast member in 2006 is not my cast right now.
That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. So as of now, with Chew, CHU, not CHEW, do you have you plotted the whole story? Do you know where it's going to go? Or?
No, I'm doing it kind of different. We're doing arcs, and you know, I have no desire to do 60 issues in a row anymore.
Right.
You know, I did it. I know I can, but I've slowed down, and the world's too crazy right now.
Sure.
So we're gonna do it Hellboy style. We're gonna put out an arc, put out a trade.
Sure.
See how it does, and do another arc. And I know how it ends.
Sure.
But it's not as structured as Chew. Like Chew, I went in and said, this is gonna run 60 issues, plotted it all out. This is gonna run as long as people want it, and as long as I wanted to do it. And I know how to end it when the time comes.
Right.
But I'd really like to just keep it open because when I return to the Chew universe, it'll be in the future and be very sci-fi. Right. This is my vehicle to tell kind of like food stories set in the modern world.
Sure.
You know, before it gets too weird with aliens and, you know, into the future and all that sort of stuff. So I kind of want to just keep it around and just do minis as they occur to me.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's very cool. So, you know, Chew, CHEW is like a food police procedural, and then you said Chew that we're getting now is going to be like food noir.
Yeah, it's capers. You know, it's you know, it's Ocean's 11. You know, with food power. You know, it's got a Tarantino vibe. It's got a John Wick vibe where, you know, there's like every caper kind of has its own like its own chef, you know, to prepare.
Right. Yeah.
You know, because each people have food power, so you bring on, you know, a team, and instead of, you know, Mr. Pink and Mr. White and, you know, Mr. Gray, you've got Mr. Baker and Mr. Gunn and, you know, Miss Getaway, and So it's very sort of, I guess, John Wick meets Reservoir Dogs in that regard. And
You
then you've
sold
got
me.
this this girl who likes to break the rules, and her power is she can learn your secrets if she eats with you. So
Oh wow.
if she's standing outside and you guys share a drink or
Right.
maybe a cigarette,
Yeah.
if you guys are drinking at the same time, the same thing, maybe she can kind of tell if you're lying, or she can kind of get a
Right.
vibe. If she sits down and eats a meal with you, that's when she starts learning your secrets.
Okay.
So she's she's everything she's doing is in furtherance of a scam.
Right.
Either to rob somebody, or to put together a crew and do some kind of caper.
Right.
So, but it's involved. She gets her information from meals.
Oh, awesome. Okay. So with that said, and I don't, if you can't talk about it, I understand. But based on the ending of the original Chew series, if you did Chew 2, would you file it under like the genre like food sci-fi at that point?
I guess so. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I'd almost say straight sci-fi. I mean, by the end of Chew, it's set in the future, and it's so science fiction, and it's such a futuristic, weird world with, aliens and crazy technology.
Right.
It would be a completely different animal than CHU Chew.
Right.
It would. One's a cop book, one's a crook book, and
Right.
one's science fiction. They'll all have food running through it.
It's so amazing that this is the same continuity, but it's just so wildly different in concept,
Yeah.
right?
Well, so one of the things that's weird is there is some overlap of characters, but certain characters who just got a bit part in the first Chew are
Right.
major characters in this book.
Okay.
And the new artist Dan Boltwood likes drawing historical stuff and
Oh, cool.
like period stuff. And we established it in Chew. Tony's got a grandfather who is sort of the original Path,
Right.
and he's super old. I mean, he ate something that allowed him to live for a long time, and
Okay.
he's a major character. So he's going to allow us to tell stories set in like World War II and the Wild West and stuff like
Okay.
that. So we get some,
That sounds
period
exciting.
going.
Very cool. Yeah, I'll be honest with you. For the longest time, I mispronounced Path just because I thought
There's
it
no
was.
correct answer. I've called it Chiba Path too. I mean, there's no right. There's no
Okay,
right or
so
wrong.
you're saying it's the open market. You can say that word however you want.
Yep.
Okay.
I won't come after you.
So, I don't think it's unfair to say that your career has been pretty eclectic. I mean, you mentioned you've worked at Marvel, you've done a lot of your own, indie IP stuff.
Yeah.
What's
I've
your
done
favorite
a lot
genre?
of weird stuff.
What's your favorite genre to work in, you think?
Well, I'll tell you, my least favorite is superheroes. Like,
Really?
it was fun to write Batman. I've written Gambit. I've written Cyclops. I have a bucket list, and I've got to write Spider-Man and Hulk
Right.
and Deadpool and Fantastic Four. And now that it's off my bucket list,
Right.
that's cool.
Yeah.
But really anything I'm a fan of, like at one point Dynamite's like, do you want to write Charlie's Angels? And it's like, oh yeah, I like that show. I could have fun with that. And they're
Yeah.
like, well, it would be with Joe Eisma. And Joe is a buddy of mine. So it's like, work on something that's fun with a friend. Like, what could be better?
Right.
So really, I just I like scratching fan itches. I've got to write Godzilla. I got to write Predator versus Judge Dredd versus Aliens.
Right.
And it's also not only the property, but who you work with. Like
Sure.
like I said, working with Joe Eisma was cool. I did Leviathan with Nick Patera, which I want to kill Nick because he hasn't finished it, but I did that because he's my friend.
Right.
I've worked with Sam Keith on a couple projects,
Yeah.
which is awesome because Sam is a legend, but he's also a good friend. So if you can, I work with John McCrae on Mars Attacks.
Yeah.
So like to work with a friend who you're also a fan of, there's nothing better.
So that actually leads me to my next question. I mean, you're an awesome writer. I mean, you've won 2 Eisners, 2 Harveys, right? What is it like to collaborate with these other artists? Like, do you have a process that you lay out early, or is it like
it's different every time? Like, I try to write to the artist's strengths, and some want to be your best friend, some want to be left alone. um, uh, it's kind of like dating. You figure out who you're compatible
Yeah,
with,
yeah,
but
absolutely.
you're also, every single relationship is different. So
Right.
there's no one way to do it. You just kind of roll with, hey, this is how the guy wants to work.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, it changes every time.
What just for edification, like what are the top three collaborations you've had in the comics industry?
Oh, I don't think that's fair because I've had so many good ones. Obviously Rob Guillory was great.
Sure.
John McCrae was great. Sam Keith, Joe Eisma, um, working with Dave Crossland way back in the day, and Jason Johnson. And I think in my 25-year span, I've only had one collaboration that I think didn't go well, and
Okay.
I'm not going to say the
No, that's
person,
fair.
but in general, I'm pretty easygoing, and like I've been, I've gotten along with all my collaborators, so
Good. Yeah.
it's hard to pick three because
Right.
I'd almost say they're all tied.
Fair.
Uh,
No, that's a good answer. That's a really good answer. Well, let me ask you this: 25 years in the comic industry, there's been a ton of talent in that time. Is there anybody that you would really like to work with and haven't had an opportunity to work with?
yeah, everybody, but it's not healthy to think that way because
Sure.
if you focus on like Frank Quietly and you never work with Frank Quietly,
Right.
then your heart gets broken. So if it's something I'm creating, I tend to find a friend or find somebody good for it. But I have also been if you're doing work for hire that you don't own for another company,
Right.
you get set up a lot.
Right.
This is your artist, and again, you end up with some like great people.
Yeah.
I did a Guardians of the Galaxy team up with a guy named Otto Schmidt, and I had never even heard of Otto Schmidt.
Sure.
And the stuff came over nice. And now I've been watching his career at DC and Marvel,
Yeah.
and I am so grateful. Like, he is a genius, and he's one of my very favorite artists.
Right.
And I did a Dead Man story last year with I don't know if it's George or Jorge Fornes, who's another like you never know who you're going to get set up, and I kind of embrace the blind date because you look back like Jason Fabok on Detective. He was just the new kid,
right?
And we worked on Detective, and now he's like a DC superstar.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I for the Man Who Effed Up Time with Aftershock, I got hooked up with this South African guy named Carl Mostert, who is blowing up at DC. Nicest guy in the world. So if you set me up with someone I've never heard of, I'm cool with it because usually I wind up with a friend.
Yeah.
And a collaboration I'm proud of.
Very cool. Okay. So outside of comics, you kind of gave me a quick tour of your office when we were setting up today. It seems like you're into Legos. Is that correct?
Not so much now, but there was a point when I just moved to moved to Phoenix, where I had a lot of money and time and didn't know anybody, and I was just building Legos like crazy. And a lot of them are still up here, but it's an expensive habit, and eventually you run out of room.
Yes.
And I've slowed down drastically on that. I mean, my hobbies are comics and video games, and I'm a consumer of pop culture. I watch movies, I play games, I watch TV, and I read comics. And I should read more books.
Yeah, fair. I think that's kind of where like me and most patrons at Coliseum are actually. Yeah. So I know right now, you mentioned that you're kind of coming to an end of a lot of your projects. Do you have any ideas like cooking as a?
Yeah, one of the frustrating things is like Chew took about 4 years to get off the ground, and Outer Darkness I thought was going to be my next thing, and it took a lot of years to get off the ground. And now I'm in the middle of a pandemic, looking at the big books I think of take me a long time to come up with.
Sure.
And people are like, oh, you've got all this time, during this pandemic, but like I've got like a slow germination project
Right.
process.
Right.
So like I don't know the idea of looking at something really big like my next novel
Right.
um, is really scary. Like I've got I've got tons of ideas for like little 5 issue things or 8 issue things, but I
Right.
like to be writing one big thing at a time, and I don't have one right now anywhere close to ready.
That's fair. Absolutely. Well, let me ask you this then. So I know you mentioned that like kind of as you're falling asleep, that's when you kind of start piecing ideas together. When you actually sit down at your computer, do you storyboard or do you block it out? Like how do you start your
I
scripts?
usually don't type until it's ready, so I spend a lot of time. Like I'm not a rewriter.
Yeah.
Like it comes out on the page. I don't want to say perfect, but I don't do a lot of drafts.
Sure.
So I spend a lot of time with it, just wheels turning, and I go for walks or I go for drives, or swim or whatever until it is such a point where I can actually sit down and do the writing.
So when you're
And
at the computer, that whole issue is up here. It just needs to come out at that point.
yeah, yeah. And it's funny because like plotting is the hard part for me, like getting the actual story.
Right.
But like pacing it is my favorite thing. And dialogue is nothing to me. Like dialogue comes really fast. And it's weird because the longest part for me is determining the story. And once I have it,
Right.
like it flows. But getting that story takes a very long time.
So when you say a very long time, so you cook the entire script in your head. You're like basically the entire issue, and then you sit down. So from the time you start thinking about it until the time you have your 22 pages, 24 pages written out, how long does that take for you? You think?
Could be days, could be weeks.
Oh, really? So it's just different every time.
Yeah, it really depends on how kind of firm the story is in my head. And sometimes, I'll write the beginning, I'll write the end, like I'll have parts of it
Right.
and put it down, and then sort of like, I think modularly like Legos. So like it's a matter of like putting all the pieces together.
Right. Okay.
And sometimes I will be missing the crucial, I'll have like 10 pages written, and they'll be like, well, what's the issue about? It's like, well, I don't know yet. That's the missing piece.
So you could be at the halfway point and you're like, I'm still figuring it out.
Yeah, especially with Chew, because a lot of it was a case. Like I would know the soap opera,
Right.
Know where the characters were, knew where it had to end.
Right.
But there's got to be a case that kind of showcases the character's ability that takes them to the next point.
Right.
And that will always be the point that got me tripped up.
So let me ask you this. You mentioned you're a comics guy. Are you reading anything currently?
I've spent a lot of this. I've been reading a ton, but I've been doing a lot of rereading of I guess I'm seeking comfort food in this kind of uncertain times. But in the last month or two, I've done a reread of Hellboy, The Goon. I did a full reread of Walking Dead, which is the first time. I read it in floppies, and then suddenly, like Kirkman dropped the ending on you.
Yes.
And
that was amazing.
But it's a different experience reading it from knowing when it's going to end. Like you can feel the climax. Like it's a very different thing reading it all in one. Let's see. I did a reread of Sandman, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Judge Dredd, Swamp Thing, Scalped, Why the Last Man, Parker. I've been reading a lot of EC archives.
Okay.
I reread Hate, which was a favorite when I was growing up, to see if it still sort of stood the test of time.
Sure.
And just my most recent reread has been Deadly Class.
Oh, awesome! I'm a big fan of that book as well.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this: so we've got CHU coming out, right? Coliseum. Most of the people that work at Coliseum are already a big fan of the original Chew. What would we like in this too? If were a customer comes in and they're like, hey, what is this? What other books would you recommend along with Chew? Well, so like, if you like this, you'll like Chew.
Yeah, it's weird because I'm saying more straight crime books like Parker and Criminal,
sure.
Maybe also Sex Criminal as well. I mean, I had some friends have read Chew, like we've got the first 3 issues, and they're like, oh, it seems a lot darker and more graphic than Chew, and it's like, then the original is like, I don't think so. I just think you're misremembering the early issues, because Chew got sillier as it went on, but it
Right.
started pretty dark.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, it's got its own rules. Like I'm really comparing it to Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul.
Okay.
And like people can debate which one they like better, but they're in their own world and they have similarities, but they
Right.
also are distinctly their own thing. And I'm not saying they're like Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, but it's the same sort of principle. You know,
Right.
it's same world, and I'll let you decide which one you want better, which one you like better,
Sure.
assuming you like them both. But they're definitely maybe a different animal of the same species.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely. And I think that comparison with the Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, they are, you know, they're set in the same universe, but they're very tonally different, especially for a very long time. So that's a very good comparison. And you'd also mentioned Chew very early on was kind of dark. I mean, doesn't Tony eat a guy's tongue in like the very first issue?
A finger.
A finger. Oh, that's right. It's his finger. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
it got progressively sillier, and I think I was leaning into Rob's sensibilities, and you know, I also knew how dark it was going to get, so I'm like disguising this tragedy as a comedy.
Sure.
But I don't know. I guess you know, no writer, you know, writing's like a river, and you're never in the same place. And you know, I'm not who I was when I was writing the original Chew in 2007, and I don't want to do the same thing. Like I know people might want the same, like they're coming back because they want to revisit the same world, but I think if I gave them the exact same thing, they'd eventually get bored.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is, you know, what the opposite of what you want to do. You know, you want to challenge people a little bit.
Right.
So you know, it's definitely its own thing, and you know, hopefully readers will respond. I have no idea.
I mean, we'll find out. I'm really excited to get a hold of this book. I mean, it's already been on FOC. We've got our order numbers in, but and I just want to say this for any Coliseum subscriber that is watching. If you want to add this to your subscription, this would probably be a really good time to do that because this book is going to be really, really cool. I'm personally super excited for it. Yeah, so get it on your subscription. You guys need to read this book.
Yes. Especially if you like Chew. I mean, it's definitely you know, it's a return. You know, if you like Tony Chew and Colby and like I said, there's some overlap of. I mean, it is a CHEW mini, the first one that will spin out the new Chew series, and not to get all comic booky, but this first mini is almost the new character Saffron. This is almost her origin, which you won't realize until you read it. You'll be like, oh, I understand exactly how she gets to the place she becomes in future minis, and it's, you know, Tony Chew plays a role in that.
This is very exciting. Are we going to see the end of Leviathan at some point?
Talk to Nick Patera. I mean, he claims he's going to, but you know, Nick, all artists are crazy, and some artists are crazier than others. And Nick belongs in a padded room. You know, I love Nick, but I want to kill him. But I won't kill him until he finishes the book. But God knows when that'll be. So yeah, talk to Nick Patera, and he will swear he'll finish it. You know, I can't do anything about it.
So if you're watching this, Nick, please finish the book. If you are a fan of Leviathan, make sure you send Nick a tweet and say, hey, where's our ending?
Yeah, I mean, Nick and I still talk every so often, or, you know, text or whatever. And he's, oh, I'm working on it. It's like, give me a break, dude. I'll believe it when I see it.
Right. Well, John, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. You've been absolutely awesome. Thank you so much for dropping by Coliseum Forum today. Chew is due out
24th or whatever that Wednesday is, around the 20th, 22nd, something like that.
19, yeah, I believe it's 24th. If you guys want, make sure you contact your local Coliseum, get that on your subscription. You know,
yeah, the first 3 issues are done, and it's a 5-issue mini, so it's coming out on time, unlike Leviathan.
There you go. John, again, thank you so much, sir. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me. Take care.